There was an idea. I'm sure we're all more than aware of it by now. Our modern media landscape has changed dramatically over the last 10 years, and I think it'd be hard to argue that the Marvel Cinematic Universe hasn't played a part in it. It's been one of the biggest cinematic juggernauts of the last decade, making well over $7.5 billion in the US box office alone before Endgame, and not only helped popularize an entire genre, but also revitalize an entire model of storytelling whose influences bled into media well beyond the scope of what anyone could have predicted. And more than anything else, it's delivered a whole slew of characters and stories that people, for the most part, have connected with, myself included. So much so that despite the awareness of more films to come and speculation of characters eventually being revived in its following installment, when Infinity War released in April 2018, well... It's kinda crazy when you think about it, and there's so much to talk about that it can be hard to wrap your head around. So, in this unnecessarily long video essay series, I will try and do just that, and talk pretentiously about these mainstream superhero films for over an hour. Oh boy, what have I set myself up for? From its humble beginnings to the productions of those following in its footsteps, to its corporate expansions, I want to look back and discuss my thoughts on the way the MCU's developed over the years, and how it's influenced our modern media landscape, for better and for worse. Today, and for the next while, I want to talk about the legacy of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And I think the best place to start is all the way back at the beginning, when the fate of this franchise was not guaranteed. In fact, it was one of the bigger risks that Marvel had ever taken. Throughout the 90s and early 2000s, shortly after recovering from bankruptcy, Marvel Entertainment licensed out its characters and IPs to practically every studio it could, with mixed results. For every box office hit its properties would be turned into, there were just as many flops and near misses. At the time, Avi Arad oversaw these deals in their productions, whilst Kevin Feige ended up working with Lauren Schuler-Donner on the development of one of these adaptations, the original X-Men film. They offered notes and advice to the filmmakers in regards to how to portray these characters, but were beginning to feel frustrated by how often their advice was ignored. In a 2017 interview with Vanity Fair, Feige explained that he thought, if something's not going to work, I'd rather it be because we had what we thought was a good idea and it just didn't work, versus we were unable to convince the decision maker to do X, Y, or Z. To make things worse, Marvel itself was making relatively little from these deals. According to one analysis, Marvel only received $62 million for the first two Spider-Man films, whose box office alone grossed over $821 and $738 million respectively. They were unsatisfied with Marvel's current setup and thought it'd be better for them to develop these adaptations themselves. That's when David Maisel pitched the idea to Arad to try and build a film series around their characters, establishing each with their own film before eventually bringing them together in a larger crossover. However, they had very few big-name characters to attempt that with, as Fox already owned the film rights for the X-Men franchise and Sony owned Spider-Man. They were left with obscure characters that only comics fans would know. Launching and marketing their own series would prove to be quite difficult. But Feige realized they still had the rights to Iron Man, Captain America, Hulk, Thor, Ant-Man, and the Wasp, the characters that made up the original Avengers team, and could launch their series around them. It was an ambitious idea and one that Arad was wary of, but for Feige the initial focus was clear. Make the best Iron Man we could, and make the best version of Hulk, even coming 5 years after another version of Hulk. While they felt the Hulk movie would be easier to sell given he was already well known, with a relatively successful TV series from the late 70s and a blockbuster film from 2003, and were indeed banking on it being able to draw people in, an Iron Man movie would be trickier to pitch. Some people were so unfamiliar with him they didn't realize he was actually human, assuming he was just some kind of robot. Though they felt they had potential, they were also acutely aware of how easily it could go wrong, and what would happen if it did was a major concern for the higher-ups at Marvel. As mentioned before, the company had only recently come out of bankruptcy, which had come about from Marvel making a series of expansions that had become unsustainable after the comic bubble of the 80s and 90s, a period of surging comic sales that resulted from a stark rise in collector culture, had burst, and only came out of it after being bought by Toy Biz in 1997. Marvel were hesitant to put money toward anything too ambitious. Ultimately though, with help and financing from David Maisel, a deal was struck. Marvel would fund the first two films with $525 million between them, and if they flopped, Marvel would sell off the rights to those characters. The MCU turned into an all-or-nothing gamble, with the Avengers themselves becoming their collateral. They worked quickly to bring on staff for the productions and get things rolling. They initially brought on 3 directors for the project: Jon Favreau for Iron Man, Louis Leterrier for The Incredible Hulk, and Edgar Wright, who had already been pitching an Ant-Man movie around the same time, and who they hoped to keep on board for it further down the line. Allard felt it was best to bring on people who weren't typical action directors, as had been done with Sam Raimi, who was originally known for his campy and over-the-top horror films like The Evil Dead for the Spider-Man films. They were filmmakers who'd done super interesting movies on a lesser scale coming into a bigger platform. That mentality of bringing on unexpected talent with a lot of potential also influenced their casting choices, led by Sarah Haley Finn, both for the series as a whole and for the first film as they eventually decided on their Iron Man.
I feel like you're driving me to court-martial. This is crazy. What did I do?
Robert Downey Jr. was a controversial choice. For the past decade, he'd been involved in a string of scandals revolving around substance abuse and addiction problems, and had only recently come out of rehab after several failed attempts to get clean. According to USA Today at the time, Downey had become a poster boy for Hollywood excess. But Favreau explained that the best and worst moments of Robert's life have been in the public eye. He had to find an inner balance to overcome obstacles that went far beyond his career. That's Tony Stark. There were many aspects of Robert Downey Jr.'s career that perfectly reflected the struggles that Tony Stark himself faced. Someone suffering with his own substance abuse issues, in this case alcoholism, and whose actions have been in the view of the public eye and put under constant scrutiny from a young age. It also helped that Downey was quite the comic book fan himself. They were confident that they'd made the best choice for the role, though there's still a lot of pressure on the cast and crew that often led to a lot of chaos on set. For example, the film had many writers working on various drafts of the film's script around the clock, but Favreau ended up leaning into a lot of improv, which frustrated Jeff Bridges, who played Obadiah Stane, and who only began to come to grips with it when he decided to think of it as a $200 million student film. Life on set was hectic, and in the middle of post-production, Allard eventually stepped away from his position in the newly founded Marvel Studios, feeling uncomfortable with the committee-based approach it was taking. As he explains, "I think everybody will be happier if they have creative committees, which I was allergic to. I know I don't have patience or temperament to get notes." Allard trusted that the company would be able to put together something great. In 2007, the team revealed the first teaser for Iron Man at that year's Comic-Con, to much excitement, and on May 2nd the next year, the movie was released worldwide. It was a massive hit, grossing over $96 million in its opening weekend, and despite some criticism regarding its antagonist and climax, the film was well received, with particular praise going toward the chemistry between its characters and Downey's performance. But quite ironically, given the amount of weight they put into it, The Incredible Hulk, which released just a month after, got a much more lukewarm reception, both critically and financially. However, Iron Man's success gave Marvel the confidence to continue on with this project, and, well, we all know what happens next. Despite the enormous success the MCU has now, given the obscurity of the characters it was working with and the view many people had of both the company and superheroes at the time, it was a massive risk that no one was sure would be able to make it off the ground. But it's one that paid off incredibly well, not only solidifying Marvel's place in the entertainment landscape, but also the status of the media it's based on. Geek, nerd, otaku, these words are used so interchangeably that the exact distinctions between them are incredibly difficult to define, beyond referring to someone with a strong interest or knowledge in a particular topic. However, these terms are most heavily associated with media and hobbies traditionally seen as sitting outside pop culture, such as games, anime and manga, comic books, role-playing, fantasy and sci-fi, and so on. But quite ironically, these fringe interests have become an integral part of the mainstream over the years. A lot of things have contributed to this. Our increasing reliance on technology and digital media has shifted its perception from a weird obsession to an unavoidable part of everyday life, and the companies that make it have skyrocketed to success as a result. That same digital technology, specifically the internet, has made it much easier for people with these interests to connect and interact, letting those communities flourish online. This increasing accessibility has also made it easier for people to become a part of those communities and, with the amount of information available to them, learn as much about it as they want. In this sense, anyone can become a nerd about anything. And most importantly, the industries, conventions, and media associated with geekdom have become unbelievably profitable. The US video game industry brought in roughly $43 billion in 2018, more than the film industry's entire worldwide box office that same year, which sat at $41 billion. Dragon Con started with just 2,400 attendees in 1989, and Comic-Con only had about 300 in 1970, but Dragon Con's attendance has ballooned to 57,000 attendees in 2013, and Comic-Con now routinely brings in tens of thousands of visitors every year. One of the biggest TV shows in the world is a fantasy epic about dragons and ice zombies, and the aforementioned box office is routinely dominated by movies based on traditionally geeky media, most notably superhero movies, which have slowly been filling up more and more of the top spots as the years have gone on, of which the most popular example is the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And I think that's quite ironic given this subgenre's history. They aren't anything new in film, as with the rise and prominence of superhero comics in the early 20th century, so too did a rise in superhero movies and television come with it. Though true of the controversies surrounding the comic book industry, the industry most heavily associated with superhero fiction, throughout the 50s and 60s regarding its depiction of violent and morally objectionable content in children's media, after a connection had been claimed between the sales of crime and horror comics and juvenile delinquency. The genre, both generally and in film, began to struggle. It wouldn't be until 1978 Superman, directed by Richard Donner, one of the most expensive movies ever made at the time, with a budget of about $55 million, which became the second highest grossing film of that year, earning well over $300 million at the box office, that a new wave in interest in superhero fiction would sweep across the media landscape. And while it's one that brought with it many hits and cult classics, it also led to a lot of flops and failures that skewed public perception of the genre as campy, over-the-top popcorn entertainment. This wouldn't change until the 90s, when more mature films like The Crow and Blade would show a grittier side to the superhero genre, following the anti-hero trend in superhero comics at the time. The early 2000s also saw a string of superhero films that ended up becoming box office successes that showed the genre's potential profitability. One of those successes was the original X-Men film, which became the 8th highest grossing film in the box office that year, and whose success was topped just a few years later by Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy, which became the highest grossing superhero film of all time. For a while at least. All this success seems to have encouraged other studios to dip their toes into the market, which arguably ended up showing the flexibility of the subgenre. It was easily possible to have both the melodrama and spectacle of films like the Spider-Man trilogy and 2004's The Incredibles, alongside the more brutal, grounded and nuanced stories of Christopher Nolan's Batman series, which in an effort to distance itself from previous adaptations of the Batman comics, went with a much grittier and more realistic approach to the idea of its vigilante. This flexibility is something that would continue to define the genre, as various movies have continued to explore that potential, with the MCU's films' tones ranging from conspiracy thrillers and royal dramas to fast-paced heist movies, and 80s pop art-infused sci-fi romps, and DC attempting to continue the Dark Knight trilogy's legacy with its extended universe's grittier tone, which we'll get back to in a later segment. Other places have also tried to push the boundaries of maturity within it, with films like Kick-Ass and Deadpool leaning into much raunchier and vulgar comedy for their stories, and some others have gone explicit in mixing it with other genres to great effect. Logan's influence from westerns and that genre's eventual downfall ties quite nicely into its study of Wolverine's character as he reaches the end of the line, and the soon-to-be-released New Mutants is seeming to be a superhero horror movie. The artistic and financial potential of superhero fiction has helped it gain notoriety over the years, and solidified its place as a staple of pop culture entertainment. Some have even argued that part of its success also stems from the way these films often reflect current events. The initial popularity of superheroes in the early 2000s, particularly of Spider-Man in 2002, has been connected to a lingering trauma resulting from the events of 9/11, with many of these films presenting audiences with heroes who were more than willing and able to protect their homes from danger and destruction, and in the case of Spider-Man, to protect New York. Similarly, Captain America Winter Soldier's questions about government surveillance and the lengths these institutions should be allowed to go to came out the year following the NSA leak in 2013, when a former NSA agent disclosed information about how US intelligence agencies had been spying on US citizens without their knowledge for years. Many superhero films have managed to tap into the cultural zeitgeist at the time they were made, and as such connected more strongly with audiences upon their release, giving them a more digestible lens through which to understand and process these issues. It's a trend that's been developing for quite a while, well before the MCU stepped onto the scene. However, I think it'd be hard to argue that the MCU has had no influence on the popularity of superhero films, as its monumental success, massive marketing power, and sheer output, with it releasing an average of 2 films a year since 2011, and as of 2017, 3 a year, has managed to keep the franchise and, as a result, the genre front and center in the public eye for 11 years. The MCU may not have started the modern obsession with superhero films, but it's certainly done a lot to keep people interested in them. I also feel like this constant exposure has helped people become more accepting of the genre's eccentricities. Like with any form of entertainment, superhero films tend to use a lot of specific tropes and tricks to tell their stories that can often get quite weird, something that's a lot more obvious in many superhero comics, and which the source material for the MCU is no stranger to. I mean, one of Captain America's greatest enemies back in the day was basically a giant head with limbs? However, the MCU slowly built upon these tropes over time rather than coming right out the gate with the weirder parts of its comics. It started off with some more grounded ideas for its first phase, or at least nothing that hadn't already been seen before. More literally in some cases than others. A man who can turn into a monster, a billionaire who builds himself a supersuit, a super soldier from World War II? Sure, why not? But as it went on, the expanding scope of its world gave it more room to fiddle around with weirder and weirder stuff, introducing characters with more obscure histories and stranger powers and premises, and tangling them up into more and more stylized films, whose respective ridiculousness is constantly crossed over into each other's narratives and built upon, to the point that now, possibly one of the biggest blockbusters of the year, if not decade, involves an ensemble group of heroes including, among others, an alien cyborg, a Norse god, and a talking raccoon, traveling across the cosmos to get revenge on a purple giant for killing half the universe with a magically bedazzled kitchen glove by clicking his fingers. You know, that actually sounds a lot stranger out loud than it did in my head. This is heightened by the franchise's striking use of imagery that highlights the spectacle of its films, whose shots not only would fit right at home as illustrations in a comic book page, but many of which are ripped straight from the comics. My personal favorite example of this is the homage paid to If This Be My Destiny, a classic story arc from the early Spider-Man comics, in Spider-Man Homecoming, which features a near shot-for-shot remake of one of its most memorable scenes, where Spider-Man finds the metaphorical and literal strength to lift the weight of his burden off his shoulders. The MCU integrated more wild and out there ideas and concepts into itself over time, slowly familiarizing general audiences with the weirdness of it all, and making them more accepting, or at least tolerant, of the more outlandish aspects of the subgenre. And I admit, it is quite easy to be cynical about the recent boom in popularity of superhero stuff. It all seems to flow from an initial interest from many studios in its profitability, and the potential market that can come from developing one's own superhero films. Hell, you could even argue that the rise in popularity of the superhero genre in the MCU has influenced the rise in geek entertainment-based films over the years, with the increasing amount of movies being based on games and anime and more, to varied results. That MCU influence even runs a bit deeper than one may think, as Avi Arad, one of the people behind the franchise originally, was a producer for the 2017 live-action adaptation of the Ghost in the Shell franchise, and is working as one for the upcoming Naruto and Borderlands movies. But at the same time, they've been able to get people engaged and tell intense, dramatic, and sometimes even philosophically dense stories whose presentation and structure shows a shocking amount of variety and flexibility with such a seemingly simple subject matter. Even the less than stellar additions to the genre have at the very least tried to do something creative with it, even if they didn't exactly hit the mark. And though the MCU may not have started this trend, it certainly played a massive role in solidifying its position within the mainstream media by keeping it in the public eye for so long, as well as getting people accustomed to the genre's eccentricities. However, the MCU has certainly been responsible for the popularization of a particular business model that's arguably defined much of cinema for the better part of the 2010s. cinematic universe is a collection of movies and/or movie series that exist within the same continuity. Basically, a film franchise made up of other film franchises. They often stem either from disparate works being connected into the same world, or from a single work being split off into many spin-offs. It's a concept that's been around in cinema for quite a while. In 1943, Universal Pictures released Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, the first in a series of films that brought together characters from the studio's classic monsters collection. Since then, there have been several interconnected film-based worlds that bring together various characters, most notably in the form of fight movies, like Freddy vs. Jason, or Alien vs. Predator, or the Ring Girl versus the Grudge Girl? But recently, there's been a whole new wave of these cinematic universes dominating the film industry throughout the 2010s, which seemed to take this simple idea to a much larger scale, from the Star Wars film expanding its main series as well as establishing anthology movies based on its world, the Harry Potter films being spun into the Wizarding world with the Fantastic Beasts series, the Rocky movies continuity being extended through Creed, the Fast and the Furious franchise having a bunch of spin-offs in development, and Fox's X-Men franchise and Warner Bros.' Lego movie having developed several spin-offs. But unlike the rest of— Wait, hold the fuck up! Hasbro apparently had plans to try and create a shared universe with the G.I. Joe and Transformers films. There were plans to try and start up a goddamn King Arthur cinematic universe? And Sony is still trying to follow through on its Spider-Man-less Spider-Man universe? Or the Sony universe of Marvel characters? God, what an awkward name. Wait, no, I'm not done here. There's so many more weird plans! As I was saying, unlike the rise of the superhero genre, the spark for this trend is one that can be directly traced back to the MCU. As mentioned before, it's a franchise that's maintained a solid presence in pop culture for the last decade, and which has proven to be incredibly profitable. But even more specifically, there are many tropes used throughout many of the cinematic universes following it that seem to come directly from the MCU. From building it around a set of iconic characters who are established in their own films before being brought together with a crossover film, to the idea of them being connected and brought together through the behind-the-scenes work of a secret government agency or some sort of hidden organization dedicated to investigating and dealing with whatever weird phenomena said characters happen to have in common. Everyone wants their own little world to work with, and there's some pretty good reasons why. It, of course, has unbelievable potential for profit, a point exemplified by both the MCU, which has grossed well over $18.3 billion in box office revenue worldwide, but also the Conjuring universe. This cinematic universe spun off from 2013's The Conjuring, a dramatization of the work of paranormal investigator Ed and Lorraine Warren. Though the series' reception tends to vary wildly from film to film, the franchise has overall managed to gross well over $1.5 billion in the box office, against a collective budget of about $103.5 million for all 5 of its films. The Conjuring universe's low-budget approach has helped it remunerate unbelievable profits for its studio. The concept of a cinematic universe also provides these studios with interesting narrative opportunities that let them make films built around their interconnected nature, something the MCU generally does its best to take advantage of. For example, its original crossover, The Avengers, is made up of characters who've already been well established and developed in their own films, and so the movie doesn't need to spend too long reintroducing them, letting it dive as quickly as it can into the fun and games of seeing these characters and their respective worlds crash into each other. The cinematic universe format lets studios and filmmakers build off the world building of an ever-expanding franchise to make films that explore the narrative threads left dangling by previous installments. You can almost think of a cinematic universe as a TV show, with each film being another episode that adds to the series' long-form narrative. Just, one with a ridiculous budget and a really long gap between episodes. Though not all cinematic universes need to be so intimately connected. The X-Men franchise, for example, largely keeps its spin-off separate from its main series with minimal crossover, allowing those extra films to explore all different facets of their world in their own way without needing to worry about how it should click together into the bigger picture. There are a lot of benefits to setting up a cinematic universe, and I could easily sit here ramble on about what makes a cinematic universe work, but there have already been more than enough people who've done a better job of that than I think I would be able to. Instead, I'd like to focus on the development of a couple of these productions, and more specifically, how they've struggled. The most obvious example here is, of course, Marvel's main competitor, DC. DC had been planning to develop their own Justice League film for years, but after the Writers Guild strike in 2008, eventually shelved the project. But in 2013, following the success they'd seen the MCU have, the DC Extended Universe, or DCEU, a cinematic universe based around DC's own superhero lineup, was launched with Man of Steel. It became the highest-grossing Superman film ever made, beating out 1978's Superman, which gave Warner Bros. The confidence to greenlight the continuation of this project, with an announcement of a Batman/Superman crossover, as well as the reveal of their film slate up to 2020 back in October 2014. However, there was a lot of criticism of the film's grittier tone, which turned into outright derision with the release of the franchise's next installment, in March 2016, Batman vs Superman: Dawn of Justice. Many critics felt like it was overburdened by a convoluted plot and constant setups for future films, and had, for the higher-ups at Warner Bros., performed below expectations. To make matters worse, Captain America: Civil War, a crossover with a similar focus on well-established heroes locked in a conflict of ideals, released only a few weeks later to critical acclaim and became the third highest-grossing film of that year, making BVS's theatrical stumble seem all the more painful. Following this reaction, there was a corporate restructuring, with Jeff Johns, a former comic writer turned executive who'd worked on many shows within the Arrowverse, DC's TV-based shared universe venture, and John Berg being put in charge of DC's film slate. Berg and Johns had a very different vision for the DCEU, believing that for their films to succeed, they needed to, as Johns put it, make sure that the characters are the characters with heart, humor, hope, heroics, and optimism at the base. However, by the time they were brought on, Suicide Squad, the next DCEU project, was already in the middle of post-production, and was facing major difficulties with reshoots and re-edits to make the film's tone fall more in line with that of its Bohemian Rhapsody trailer, which had garnered an incredibly positive reaction online. Though they would end up finding major success in applying a more optimistic tone to Wonder Woman, the first DCEU film to be received positively, they would face another major hurdle with Justice League. It was originally helmed by Zack Snyder, who was continuing with the darker tone of Man of Steel and Dawn of Justice, which he also directed. But there was a lot of talk internally about how to make the film more lighthearted, and Joss Whedon was eventually brought on to help during reshoots to do just that. But sadly, in March 2017, in the middle of production, Snyder's daughter died by suicide. Snyder did his best to stick with the project, but eventually departed in May to grieve. This left Joss Whedon in charge of the film's post-production, which involved 2 months worth of reshoots and an enormous amount of rewrites and edits. But upon release, Justice League ended up being a critical and, for Warner Bros., financial flop. Following its release, there was yet another corporate restructuring within Warner Bros., with John Berg leaving his position and eventually being replaced by Walter Hamada, who recently helped develop the Conjuring universe. The DCEU was one whose potential was mired by conflicting visions about what it should be, and whose constant shifts left the franchise feeling directionless and messy. That isn't to say it's a complete failure, as it has had some standout hits, with both Wonder Woman and Shazam being critical and commercial successes, and Aquaman, though having a mixed reception, managing to make over $1 billion in the box office. And I think it's quite telling that the most successful DCEU movies are the ones most disconnected from its larger world. Similarly, Universal's Dark Universe has faced just as much trouble getting off the ground. As mentioned before, Universal's Classic Monsters collection was the original cinematic universe, and the Dark Universe seemed like it was essentially trying to be a reimagining of that concept, by creating a series based around their classic movie monsters. But ironically, it's something they haven't just had trouble getting to launch once, but twice. Though 2017's The Mummy is the first official Dark Universe film, 2014's Dracula Untold, a horror film that sought to explore the origin of its titular monster, had reshoots to tie the film into the wider world Universal was trying to build, in hopes that if it did well, it in itself could kickstart the franchise. However, after its negative reception, Universal treated the film as non-canon, and continued with their original plan by starting with The Mummy, a big-budget blockbuster with an all-star cast featuring the likes of Tom Cruise and Russell Crowe, which was to be followed up by Bride of Frankenstein in early 2019. However, it flopped, both financially and critically, bringing in just about $80 million domestically on an estimated $195 million budget that was only able to break even thanks to the international box office, and which was panned by critics, with many taking issue with Dr. Jekyll's involvement, feeling as though it took away from the main story for the sake of franchise building, which is quite ironic given the way its director Alex Kurtzman has talked about cinematic universes, believing that the only way you can build a universe is not to start by trying to build a universe. That if you want to get there, the only way you're going to get there is if the audience allows you to get there, meaning you have to do great individual films first. The audience has to fall in love with those movies first and those characters first, and if they do and you develop an organic story reason to start bringing them together, great. But you can't start with let's just mash everybody together. Following The Mummy's release, Universal's future Dark Universe projects have been delayed and as yet have not been given a new release date. Universal's president of production, Peter Kramer, explains, "We are not rushing to meet a release date and will move forward with these films when we feel they are the best versions of themselves." Despite its best efforts, Universal's mega franchises struggled to gain traction, which personally I think is kinda sad given their history with cinematic universes. It seems that it isn't enough to simply expect a cinematic universe to work. Cinematic universes require a studio to strike a careful balance between concrete planning and creative and narrative freedom to give their world a strong direction while also letting each installment of said world have enough room to breathe, and develop their own stories and characters enough for people to connect with them, something which the MCU has managed to excel at. However, despite its success, the MCU has still faced its own share of issues, namely in how ironically restrictive their productions can be. For as much wiggle room as its filmmakers are given, they're still limited by the bigger picture for the franchise, to ensure that things are not only going according to plan and all the right plot points are being hit, but also to ensure that their films have a consistent feel that defines them as MCU films. I'm sure we've all seen the videos on the MCU's color grading and soundtracks. In some cases, this can lead to people leaving the project altogether. Edgar Wright, despite how long he'd been pitching it and how involved he'd been with the early MCU, eventually left Ant-Man. According to Wright, for as much as he enjoyed working with them, it felt like he wanted to make a Marvel movie, but I don't think they really want to make an Edgar Wright movie. For as many opportunities as a cinematic universe may provide, the extensive planning and control that can come with it can restrict what filmmakers are able to do on its individual installments. The cinematic universe has a lot of artistic and commercial benefits, but which requires such a delicate balance of so many different interconnected aspects of production to get right that it's no wonder so many studios have struggled to set one up, and which even for companies that manage to make it work can still end up causing problems. It's honestly kind of a miracle that the MCU works at all, and it seems like it's managed to extend its look with this format beyond the world of cinema. The full scope of the MCU's world has expanded beyond its films. This seems to have always been on their minds after Disney's acquisition of Marvel in 2009, as according to an article by CNN, Bob Iger, Disney's current CEO, on a conference call with investors, said the deal will allow Disney to sell Marvel's vast array of characters and properties across different media platforms and in many more markets. And Ike Perlman, former CEO of Marvel Entertainment, believed it was an unparalleled opportunity for Marvel to build upon its vibrant brand and character properties by accessing Disney's tremendous global organization and infrastructure around the world. Both Disney and Marvel see a lot of potential in the company's massive roster of IPs, and through the MCU have tried to realize it by branching it out as much as they can, in the form of short films, comics, and most notably, TV shows. In June 2010, Marvel Television was launched as a subdivision of Marvel Entertainment, with Jeff Loeb as its head, and by July 2012 had gone into talks with ABC to develop their first serialized venture, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., a series revolving around the day-to-day work of the titular defense agency and the many superpowered dilemmas they deal with. Its premiere episode in September 2013 garnered about 12 million viewers and a 4.6 out of 14 rating among 18 to 49-year-old demographics, making it one of the biggest network drama debuts in years, and has maintained enough popularity to be renewed for 5 and what will soon be 6 seasons. Marvel Television continued to build its library over the years, including various video-on-demand series, such as 4 dramas and a miniseries totaling over 60 episodes worth of content that would later be known as Netflix's Marvel series, featuring a variety of street-level heroes living in New York that began with the release of Daredevil in 2015. According to Jeff Loeb, this package was Marvel's attempt at adapting the Avengers formula for TV, by establishing each hero with their own show, before having them cross over with a miniseries. Later in 2017, a show based on the Runaways was put together for Hulu, and one based on Cloak and Dagger for cable television in 2018. The majority of Marvel Television's live-action work primarily revolves around producing auxiliary content for the MCU, but they have collaborated on the production of Legion and The Gifted, both series set within Fox's X-Men universe. It's easy to be cynical here and see it all as a way for Marvel and Disney to expand their profit lines, give them revenue through TV ads, licensing fees, and more properties to merchandise, but at the same time it also provides a lot of narrative opportunities, letting us shine a light on lesser known characters for which it will be harder to justify funding an entire film for. In regards to the Netflix deal, Bob Iger has said as much, stating that while these characters are attractive, they are not among the most popular, and they are characters that we probably were never going to make feature films about. In that same vein, it also lets them tell stories that have no way of fitting into the mainline series. Based on the 2003 comic of the same name about a group of children realizing their foster parents are part of a crime syndicate, a film for Runaways had been in development since 2008, but after the immense success of The Avengers in 2012, the project was shelved as Marvel redirected their focus. However, in August 2016, after years of negotiations, Hulu ordered a pilot and scripts for a full serialized version of The Runaways. Similarly, Inhumans was originally planned to be part of the MCU's Phase 3 lineup back in October 2014, with Kevin Feige commenting on how they
can be a franchise and perhaps series of franchises onto themselves.
However, it was later removed from their lineup and reworked into a TV series, as Marvel felt that with such a wide cast of characters and backstories, a longer format would give them more freedom to explore that, something they'd already tried with some Inhumans characters that were introduced in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Of course, Inhumans would later go on to be one of the worst received Marvel series so far, with a lot of issues seemingly stemming from an incredibly tight production schedule, but still. The MCU's serialized content gives them a way to tell smaller stories within their world. This is often used to build on their universe, with many series exploring how it copes with the fallout of the film's high-flying antics. This is quite prevalent in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., which has often been praised for the way it's built around the major events of the films, particularly those of Winter Soldier and Civil War. This, alongside obvious budgetary restraints, lets them shift the focus to the perspective of everyday inhabitants of the MCU, and what life is like in the superpowered world for the less than super, of which I think the best example is the aforementioned Netflix series. These shows give us a more grounded perspective on it all, following characters living in New York after the events of Avengers with minimal, if any, enhanced capabilities, who are much more vulnerable than their big screen counterparts, often being bloodied to uncomfortably brutal degrees, something that even its superpowered characters aren't immune to. In the first season of Jessica Jones, which follows the exploits of a private investigator gifted with super strength trying to get her life back together after escaping an abusive relationship, Luke Cage, a man with bulletproof skin on the run who would later get his own series, receives a shotgun blast to the face, which causes brain hemorrhaging that can't be properly treated since his skin can't be cut through, to open up space for his brain to swell out of, proving to be near fatal for the character. I mean, more fatal than a shotgun shell to the face should be, but, you know, superpowers. They generally face more street-level villains and conflicts, drug dealers, gang warfare, murderers, abusers, corruption, things that, though still exaggerated, sometimes to a ridiculous degree, feel more down-to-earth than the world-ending battles focused on in the films. Marvel's Netflix shows expose the grittier corners of its world and how more average people deal with it. They each even have their own feel that, in themselves, add an extra lens through which to understand this world. There's a brutal crime drama about a blind vigilante's crisis of faith, to a noir detective thriller about a woman trying to take back control of her life after being manipulated and used, to a hip-hop western about a black man's strained relationship with justice trying to help his community, what I assume was supposed to be a kung fu action about a young man's understanding of inheritance, legacy, and destiny? Not the biggest fan of Iron Fist, so please correct me if you think I'm off here. And a violent, slow-burn conspiracy thriller about a former soldier looking for revenge on the system that destroyed him. Despite the obvious similarities that come from being made under the same company and in the same location, each has their own stylistically and thematically distinct approach that lets them explore their respective issues in their own way, something that's helped by the amount of time the serialized format affords them to do so. According to Melissa Rosenberg, the showrunner for Jessica Jones, part of this comes from the amount of creative freedom afforded to them by Netflix. There's no pilot and then getting feedback, reaction, and ratings. You're in this bubble. So, what's the story you want to tell? Where do you want to go with the characters? But at the same time, that longer runtime has also been one of the bigger criticisms levied against these shows. For a long time, the main series has had a fixed 13-episode length for each season, which many felt negatively affected the pacing of each series, forcing them to be dragged out longer than they need to be, and it's one I personally agree with. I felt like very few seasons of the sub-franchise actually needed all that time. Most could have easily been cut down to 10 or even 8 episodes and still worked just as well, if not better. Hell, even The Defenders, the shortest series in the whole thing, still felt like it meandered quite a bit. Though they did seem to ease up on that quota toward the end, with Iron Fist Season 2 being shortened to 10 episodes, and Luke Cage's third season reported to be following suit. Though flawed in their own way, Marvel's Netflix shows exemplify the MCU's ability to explore different facets and perspectives of its world through these smaller projects. Of course, it'd be hard to bring the Netflix shows up and not at least touch on how they all got axed. Throughout late 2018 and early 2019, Netflix announced the cancellation of these properties one by one, starting with Iron Fist and Luke Cage in October, Daredevil in November, and Punisher and Jessica Jones just a few months ago, with the third season of Jessica Jones planned to be the last installment. The announcements came as quite a shock to fans and crew alike. The writers for Luke Cage had already begun to develop scripts for Season 3, and the ones behind Daredevil had planned the series out through to a 5th season. Daredevil's cancellation was especially surprising since it was still one of Netflix's most popular shows at the time. Even Marvel was surprised by it, as they'd been expecting the shows to simply continue. Netflix's decision seemed to have come out of nowhere, but when digging into it, things become a lot clearer. According to some surveys, viewership for these shows had steadily declined, with Daredevil's third season, despite the critical praise it had received, lost 61% of its audience from season 2. And with the shows being Marvel-owned IP, Netflix was paying to license them for every season they put together following the initial deal. Alongside the exorbitant fees that came from filming in New York, it seemed like they were burning money on shows that weren't worth the investment anymore. There's also been some speculation that it was a move on Netflix's part to try and strengthen its position in the streaming market against its upcoming competitor, Disney+, owned by the same company Netflix is paying for these shows. But overall, it seems that Netflix's investment in these shows were giving them diminishing returns. Not every MCU project is as sustainable as one may think, at least not for the companies hosting them. Despite this, Marvel has shown no signs of slowing down its serialized expansions. There are plans to create another VOD package for Hulu featuring a cast of villains who will eventually cross over with a miniseries called The Offenders, one of which will be about the talking head with limbs. See, I told you Marvel was getting into weirder shit! Disney has also announced various MCU shows for Disney Plus about various side characters, including a prequel for Loki, a romance for Wanda and Vision, and apparently a buddy cop style series for Bucky and Falcon. While I am curious to see how they turn out, I also can't help but start to think that it's slowly starting to be almost too much to take in. For example, one of the bigger criticisms of the MCU is how it feels like they can often lack consequences, as the major events of the series seem to have little ramifications on its world. But what's often used to show this is the collapse of S.H.I.E.L.D. and Winter Soldier, and the reintroduction of Hydra, as just 2 movies later, Hydra is seemingly defeated for good and Nick Fury and his team is back in action with the helicarriers, as if S.H.I.E.L.D's collapse never really happened. It feels like these revelations had little effect on the MCU's world, at least if you're watching the movies, since the second season of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. is all about exploring the wider ramifications of Winter Soldier and its characters' efforts to rebuild S.H.I.E.L.D. and deal with Hydra agents who've infiltrated the organization. Or at least that's what I gather from plot summaries, given that I haven't seen Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. The wider ramifications of the MCU's major events are explored, it's just not done in detail in the films. Because the MCU is not just the films anymore. It's everything. To quote Meryl Barr, television critic for Forbes, in his review of the finale of Season 1 of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., what Marvel's daring to say is everything we do matters, and you need to pay attention to all of it. Though this quote is meant to be in praise of Marvel, I think it also perfectly encapsulates the wider issue with the MCU's expansions. It isn't enough to simply keep up with the nearly 45 hours worth of films anymore. Marvel is building its franchise in such a way that if you actually want to see how things develop, you need to also be keeping up with all 25 seasons of television it is currently produced, which totals well over 300 hours, with much more on the way soon. And that's not even taking into consideration the dozens of short films, comics, and other side content for the MCU. And I don't want to give away too many endgame spoilers, at least for now. But I will say, for as much of a sense of finality as it gives to the franchise, it's also filled with plenty of setups and dangling narrative threads that will only be resolved in its Disney Plus shows. As it branches out with more media and more mediums on more platforms, it feels like it's expecting its fans to similarly keep up with every project they dive into, something that, for those who haven't already, becomes an increasingly unreasonable task to accomplish as time goes on. This may not seem too drastic, especially given the times we live in where most of us have access to unlimited amounts of content at the tip of our fingers. And I will admit, maybe I'm just overthinking it all. Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. is the only series that the MCU really uses to fill in its gaps, and every other series only has loose connections to the films. But I can't shake this feeling of a growing expectation this mega franchise is coming with to keep up. At a certain point, watching the MCU starts to feel less like dipping into something you think will be fun to watch, and that'll get you invested in an impactful story, and more like a chore, watching it just so you don't miss out. But it's hard for me not to wonder and even worry about the way this expectation may affect the way in which the MCU creates its content, which has already been shown to be developing flaws. I'd almost say that the MCU's expansion expansions seem like building up a massive library of content just for the sake of having a massive library of content. The MCU's expansions into other media, while providing more creative opportunities for its world, can also be seen as a growing desire for its owners to maximize their reach, something that Marvel's parent company, Disney, seems hellbent on taking advantage of both for the MCU and its other properties, including the ones they've recently acquired. I will admit, this is probably the most tangential segment of this whole project, given it's much more focused on something that's only connected to the MCU rather than directly about it, with the company involved owning Marvel and thus the MCU, and one of the most talked about aspects of the situation being how the MCU will have more classic Marvel properties to use for its ever-growing universe, that for so long have been completely out of reach, and the various ways that it could try and introduce them into its world. And for as interesting as I think that may be to talk about, I also think for a project called The Legacy of the MCU, I think it'd be more important to discuss the wider implications such a situation being made a reality could have on the entertainment industry as a whole. So...
Homer Simpson here, proud addition to the Disney family and soon appearing on Disney+. I, for one, salute our new corporate overlords. Now, family, put on the mouse ears. You only get one chance to make a first impression.
In March 2019, Disney finalized a deal to acquire 21st Century Fox for up to $71.3 billion. This deal gave Disney control over 20th Century Fox and all the studios working under it, a 30% share in Hulu that, alongside the 30% Disney already owned, gives them a controlling interest in the service, stakes in various international networks such as Star India and a 39% stake in Sky, whose network serves 39 million households across Europe, and ownership of all of Fox's IPs and film rights, including the X-Men franchise. Some of 21st Century Fox's assets, specifically those relating to news and sport, were split off and relaunched as their own separate entity, Fox Corp, to comply with antitrust regulations. While there are many who have been pleased with the merger, particularly Marvel fans who are happy to see one of their most iconic franchises return home, there are many more who are concerned by its potential ramifications in putting more ownership of the film industry and the wider media landscape into the hands of fewer companies. And there's enough precedent to justify a concern about how these companies, specifically Disney, may exploit that position, as once happened back during the days of the studio system. The studio system was a structure of film development in place in Hollywood from the early 1920s to the late 1940s, defined by the control exerted over the industry by 8 major film studios. They're typically broken up into 2 groups, the Big Five and the Little Three. The Big Five were studios that were fully integrated, meaning they controlled every aspect of their films, from production to distribution to usually exhibition. These studios were the Fox Film Corporation, later known as 20th Century Fox, Loews Incorporated, later known as Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer or MGM, Paramount Pictures, RKO Radio Pictures, and Warner Bros. Meanwhile, the Little Three were studios that, while not fully vertically integrated, still had substantial sway over the market. These studios were Universal Pictures, Columbia Pictures, and United Artists. In 1939, combined, these 8 studios owned a nearly 95% share of the total film market. 10 years later, in 1949, they owned 96. These studios practically were the industry. As a result, many of them felt confident in implementing a variety of questionable business practices to secure their positions, most notoriously block booking, a practice introduced by Paramount Pictures. This was a tactic in which studios would sell multiple films to independent theaters in one block. With this, the major studios could sell off large amounts of cheaply produced movies alongside big budget features, something these studios believed kept costs low and profits high. However, it also meant that in order to have any sort of feature film on their playbill, these theaters had to buy and screen the entire block they came with as well. Worse still, these blocks were often sold with little information about many of the films the theaters were buying. This is referred to as blind bidding. This led to these theaters' screens being completely booked up for extended periods of time, in some cases for up to a year. This prevented independent filmmakers from having a chance to screen their productions, stifling competition in the market. And some civil groups were even concerned that with the lack of regulation these studios were under, this practice could lead to theaters being forced to screen films with, questionable moral values. What kind of 30s ass nonsense? Despite these concerns, the major studios were able to get away with it because of the onset of the Great Depression. During this time, the film industry's shadier practices were tolerated by the government, who believed it could help keep the economy stable. This bolstered the major studios' confidence to strengthen their factory line-like productions and tighten the restrictions on their contracts for cast and crew, strengthening their ever-tightening grip on the industry. However, that goodwill eventually faded as the studio's position was put under more and more scrutiny, with multiple multiple court cases and various proposals for legislation that would ban block booking and break up their vertically integrated systems. In 1940, an initial compromise was met with a consent decree, which set out a list of conditions for the major studios to follow to avoid further prosecution. These conditions were to limit block booking to just 5 films per block, to no longer include shorts in these blocks, that studios would show theaters each film before allowing them to be bought, which was known as trade showing, and to set up a self-regulatory board to enforce these conditions. But rather than follow these rules, the major studios banded together, alongside the allied theater owners, and formed a unity plan, which sought to increase the block limit to 12 films with more liberal rejection policies for theaters. This decision led to many independent filmmakers, including, quite ironically in retrospect, Walt Disney, outraged by the major studios' actions, to form the Society of Motion Picture Producers, and file a lawsuit against the studios for breaking the consent decree. The case was brought to trial in October 1945, and in December 1946, the major studios were found guilty. However, their vertical integration was not initially seen as an issue. The collusion with multiple theater chains was seen as tantamount to conspiracy, and so the studios were allowed to keep their theaters so long as they didn't pool them together. Both sides were dissatisfied, and so the case was brought to the Supreme Court, who ruled in favor of the independent artists on every issue. The major studios would continue to fight against the ruling, however, arguing that their businesses wouldn't be able to survive without vertical integration. But one of the big 5, RKO, immediately complied with the Supreme Court ruling, splitting itself into 2 distinct entities, RKO Pictures Corporation and RKO Theaters Corporation, with its CEO, Howard Hughes, who at the time was known for his erratic business decisions, promising to sell off his control of one of them eventually. It's thought that Hughes' decision was driven by a belief that this separation could help his business, as being one of the smaller major studios, the resulting dissolution of the other studios would give RKO a better chance to compete in the market. This undermined the major studios' arguments, and following this precedent, further court cases against individual studios ruled in favor of divorcement. This, alongside a rise in popularity of TV and the resulting competition abroad, eventually led to the slow disintegration of the studio system over the next decade. Ironically though, this actually did end up leading to a decline in the film industry that took quite a while for it to recover from. The reason to bring any of this up is that the modern film industry has begun to resemble that old structure, as 5 major studios backed by larger media conglomerates have an enormous influence, more so than what the old Big 5 had. The old Big 5 had a collective market share of about 74%, with MGM sitting on top with 22%. But the modern Big 5 collectively owns around 85%, with Disney sitting at 36%. For reference, in 1986, the market share of what at the time was the Big 6, Paramount, Warner Bros., Columbia, Universal, Fox, and MGM, had shrunk to 64%, and independent studios altogether made up about 13% of the market. Furthermore, though the studios themselves aren't vertically integrated, their parent companies are, giving them complete control over not just the production of their films, but also whatever other media they happen to own. The studio system's structure of consolidated power has come back, and with it comes that same potential for exploitation. And at the center of it is Disney and the Fox merger. This deal, as mentioned before, gives Disney control over a massive portion of the film industry and an even greater influence over the media landscape. Many are concerned about the way this will end up affecting theaters, as Disney may try to use its influence to get better cuts out of their film profits. It already takes a 60% cut of ticket prices for its bigger releases, such as the Star Wars or Avengers films, well above the standard 50% split between theaters and studios. With more control over those theatrical releases, Disney could pressure theaters into agreeing to handing over a larger take of those profits, something that may be bolstered by Disney's venture into streaming services, which potentially give them the opportunity to bypass theatrical release altogether, which would deal a massive blow to the already struggling theater market. Disney's controlling stake in Hulu and its soon-to-be launched VOD service, Disney Plus, combined with its now unparalleled library of content to host on those services, could give it an unbelievable amount of power in the streaming market, especially considering the possibility of them bolstering their services by hosting newly released features on them sooner than they'd release them on DVD or Blu-ray. The deal could lead to less films being made every year, as Disney funnels Fox's profits away from small to medium-sized projects and towards bigger and bigger budget features, which also ironically happened with the major studios in the studio system. It would essentially put the industry in a state where studios are less willing to take risks on anything that isn't guaranteed to be a monumental hit. And though Disney's recent film slate shows little signs of slowing down any of Fox's current productions, it has recently shown a willingness to stop some from from getting underway, with the cancellation of Mouse Guard, Fox's adaptation of the comic series of the same name just 2 weeks before it was meant to start production. The reasons for this are unclear, but there are various claims from insiders that range from Disney wanting Fox to focus on low-budget family films and or more mature R-rated features, to the company simply not having faith in the project at all. Luckily, its creators have been allowed to take the project elsewhere, but it's easy to imagine how easily Disney could have prevented such a thing. Of course, even if there was a decline in films from Disney, it could open up the potential for other companies to fill in the gap with their own features, but they would also more than likely be more big-budget blockbusters, furthering that budgetary divide. Some have even compared this potential to the state of the video game industry, which is largely split between AAA releases and indie projects, with an ever-dwindling market of medium-sized productions. Some worry about the way Disney may influence the new media properties it now owns. It could try and sanitize more mature and outlandish IPs to make them fit Disney's family-friendly brand better, or in some cases outright stop them from being produced. Though, according to insiders, Disney is planning to use Hulu to host and distribute its edgier content, given Hulu had already built itself around more adult content, such as the Emmy Award-winning Handmaid's Tale. There's also been some speculation about the way Disney may try to expand its newly owned IPs, just as it's arguably done with its slew of live-action remakes of animated classics, and franchising of properties it already owned, such as the MCU and Star Wars, and which seems to be confirmed by their plans to develop more installments for Alien, Planet of the Apes, and even Kingsman, which, as described in the previous segment, comes with its pros and cons. On the one hand, providing them and their filmmakers to explore the artistic and narrative possibilities prevented by these franchises' worlds, but on the other, having the potential to lead to a bit of a quantity over quality situation. Some are even concerned about the way Disney may use this newfound influence to censor certain messages within the media they produce, specifically the ones that could potentially harm their reputation and bottom line, something Disney has already shown itself to be more than willing to do. In response to an article by the Los Angeles Times criticizing Disney for this deal and the power it will give them over the industry back in 2017, Disney blacklisted the entire company from press screenings. It led to a massive backlash both online and in real life, leading to Disney eventually reversing their decision, but which only came after intense scrutiny. Disney has already shown that it's more than willing to pull some shadier tricks in order to silence criticism in the past, and it's not hard to imagine that with even more sway over the industry, they'd be willing to get even more intense with it. And that's just some of the stuff that's been coming out of this. I haven't even talked about the ramifications it might have on the contracts and job opportunities for cast and crew and workers within the industry itself. Hell, the first thing that happened was a wave of job cuts at Fox, which came about as a result of duplication of positions within the newly merged company, with as many as 3,000 to 4,000 layoffs expected to be made over the coming months. Now, I don't want to just turn this into a Disney evil video, mostly because I think that mentality oversimplifies the situation. But it's clear that Disney's already been willing to exploit their position in the past, and this merger may just bolster that confidence, something that has indeed happened with similar situations of consolidated power in the past. Disney and the new Big Five have an immense amount of power at their disposal. Of course, it is all speculation. We don't really know how Disney's going to use their newfound capabilities, but the possibility is still there. And it isn't exactly a small one, which is quite ironic since to me that sentiment is also at the very heart of the MCU's larger narrative. Now it's time to break down the themes and symbolism of each individual movie under the lens of various literary theories to find the deeper message hidden just beneath the yeah fuck that. This video is getting long enough as it is and I just do not have that kind of patience. I was even half tempted to scrap this section altogether, but I think it'd be weird to not at least briefly talk about the films themselves, considering that the most tangible part of the MCU's legacy lies in the stories it will leave behind. And yes, I do mean briefly. The workload of this project is starting to drive me a little nuts. However, given the popularity of the franchise and the amount of people who've covered its many achievements and pitfalls over the years, I'm not sure what I would be able to contribute to the discussion, besides maybe just my own experience. The first Iron Man movie came out when I was 10 years old and I turned 21 just 2 months before Endgame. Iron Man, Captain America, and Thor became some of the most iconic characters of my teenagehood, I guess you'd call it. Hell, going to see each movie became a bit of a tradition for me, my brothers, and my sister, turning the MCU in a touchstone for us to connect through. It's played a pretty decent part in my life, and I'm sure I'm not the only one for whom it's done so. I literally grew up on the MCU, and over the years, it feels like it's grown up with me. It started off with clear clear-cut stories about good guys stopping bad guys, and centering around flawed characters, both reckless ones faced with the consequences of their actions, and idealistic ones standing up for themselves and others in a world against them, dealing with immense power in all its different forms, from literal superpowers they had since birth, developed for themselves, stole for themselves, or had thrust upon them, whether they like it or not, or in the more abstract but just as tangible power that comes from the economic, social, and political positions they were born into. They realize not only the importance of making up for their mistakes, but also how they should use their powers for the benefit of others, instead of for their own gain. It's all about the great responsibility that comes with great power. I know, really groundbreaking stuff for a superhero movie, it's crazy. However, what that actually means becomes more and more difficult to figure out as it progresses. Despite their best efforts, these heroes' past is constantly coming back to haunt them. The world they thought they knew and the systems and institutions they put their trust into not only reveal themselves to be easily manipulated, but worse, are often the very reason the villains they face are who they are. Even what it means to do the right thing in itself ends up putting these heroes into direct conflict with each other. The question of power is one that becomes harder and harder to answer as we and these characters develop and learn more about this world. It even seems to suggest that the consolidation of too much power into the hands of too few is bad, because of how much damage misusing and abusing that power can cause. Which is quite ironic given the last segment of this video project, but maybe I'm reading a bit too deeply into it. You'd even argue the MCU has matured stylistically, with Phase 1 giving us these almost whimsical action adventures, Phase 2 delving into a darker, more serious phase that streamlined its tone, and tropes with only slight hints of personality here and there, before Phase 3 let it come into its own, maturing into lavishly colourful and more visually experimental films that can do more or less whatever they want, because they're an adult and they don't need to answer to any parents or teachers anymore, just their boss. The thematic and stylistic exploration of the MCU has become more complex over the years. Of course, it's not without its issues. As varied as these films may be on a surface level, they can often feel repetitive and even formulaic, as they reuse the same set of tropes and story beats over and over and over again. And worse still, its focus on building up the bigger picture can leave some of its installments to buckle under the weight of the franchise's own ambition, being turned into vessels for world building and franchising rather than being their own fully fledged stories. But it's a caveat that becomes worth it when those threads are finally tied together, which brings me to the inevitable. Like with the MCU as a whole, I'm not sure what I could say about this that hasn't already been said. It's a generally fun movie with a lot of great moments and clever subversions that I think manages to stick the landing of its 11-year build-up, well enough to gut punch you right in the feels. But at the same time, it's also one whose meandering plot and sometimes questionable handling of its characters makes it difficult for me to fully embrace. And despite the title, it also establishes several plot threads that will only be resolved and dealt with in its Disney Plus shows and future films, and introduces enough new elements for the franchise to expand itself ad nauseum, potentially transforming it from the Marvel Cinematic Universe and into the Marvel Cinematic Multiverse. Which, as curious as I am to see how that would work, only plays into the concerns I discussed in parts 4 and 5 of this video. And don't even get me started on the time travel. Weirdly, I feel like Endgame ends up representing both the best and the worst of the MCU, using its world building and long-term storytelling for incredibly satisfying payoffs, but whose sense of finality we know to be fleeting at best. But if nothing else, it does at least bring the journeys of its main cast to a close. The spy with Red in her ledger finds a way to pay off her debt. The scientist running from his demons is finally able to come to terms with his trauma. The prince who lost everything realizes that he does not need a throne to be worthy. The soldier out of time ready to leap into the line of fire at a moment's notice gets to leave this war and go home to live his life. And the engineer constantly fiddling and tinkering and working to fix his machines, his ideas, and his mistakes finally gets to rest. It's nice to see these characters actually get an ending, even if it's only temporary. There's a lot to both praise and criticize about the MCU stories on a micro and macro level, but at the end of the day, it's a franchise I can't help but appreciate. Despite how much of a risk it initially was to take, the Marvel Cinematic Universe has become a monumental success, one that solidified and popularized with it trends that have arguably defined the last decade of film, and which provided a grand narrative that's connected with a whole generation of moviegoers. And that's just what we've seen so far. But while it may be easy to wonder about how it will eventually fall by the wayside, as all genres and franchises do, I'm not sure it will, or at least not anytime soon. Even its less than well-received films still end up raking in hundreds of millions at the box office, and with rumors that the studio has plans for it all the way through to 2028, it's hard to tell if it will ever come to an end. It might turn into an ever-rotating roster of characters and actors and directors and behind-the-scenes talent constantly slipping in and out of its lineup to refresh our expectations when they start to wane. And with how much Disney has gained from the MCU and the amount of sway they now have, I wouldn't be surprised if they at the very least tried. And I don't know how to feel about that. For as many criticisms as I have for it, it's a franchise I literally grew up on. It's provided me with some solid entertainment over the last 10 years that's clicked for me both narratively and aesthetically, and some of whose installments have hit me harder than I ever would have thought possible. But its ever-expanding scale, both in terms of its production budget, the quantity of its branching media, and the ever-expanding influence of its owners is a bit concerning. In the end, I think that is the true legacy of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It's not in the tropes and formulas and business practices it popularized and reinvigorated, but in the never-ending storyline it set up for itself, that has no idea when or where to stop, for better and for worse. And yeah, those are my thoughts. God damn, this was a big-ass project. I've been working on it slowly, bit by bit, over the last few months, and god, there's just so much to go through here. My original notes document was about 189 pages, and the first draft was about 18,000 words, which, with my guess, would equal about 90 minutes of video. That's fucking feature film length. I wanted to make something Marvel-related for Endgame's release, and had a bunch of ideas, and wasn't sure which one to go with, until I eventually thought, hey, maybe for this discussion of a film series with many standalone installments that connect into one longer narrative, I could make a video series with many standalone installments that connect into one longer essay. It seemed like a fun project that just let me ramble about thoughts I've been having about the MCU for a while now, so fuck it. Though I do plan on doing some follow-ups for this. The first one I want to do is a sort of footnotes video going over any corrections and concerns that need to be made and addressed, as well as responding to general comments and questions and etc. So be sure to send me all your comments and questions, any corrections or errors you spotted. I'll also be going over those myself, any criticisms or concerns you have, and etc. And I'll be dealing with them as soon as I can. Anyway, tell me what you think. If you agree, disagree, why you think of the MCU, why your favorite piece of the MCU is. For me, Guardians of the Galaxy and Daredevil are fantastic, and Ant-Man is criminally underrated. Tell me why you think of Disney's corporate takeover, because that's always fun, etc. And thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this and want to see more, check out my last video, where I ramble about my top things of spring 2019. Or check out my video on Mob Psycho 100 and its credible use of animation. And don't forget to like, comment, share, and of course, subscribe to come flag me. You can also follow me on Twitter for more updates on this channel and other stuff, and hopefully I'll see you later. Or in a while, at least. I feel like I should probably take some kind of break after all this. Christ, even my voice is starting to go after recording all this. Christ.